Emma and I had only been married for 3 months. She had a knack for making everything seem exciting, spontaneous, and fresh. So when she suggested we have a wild night out after a particularly grueling work week, I thought, why not? We lived in Denver, and there was no shortage of fun things to do in the city. She left the decision up to me, which was a little unusual since she usually does the planning. But I wanted to impress her, to be a fun, laid-back husband. Then I thought of the Velvet Orchid, one of those high-end strip clubs they say is a secret speakeasy. I'd never been there, but I'd heard it wasn't exactly a casual establishment. Classy cocktails, good music, and performers that Cirque du Soleil might seem amateurish by comparison. Emma's eyes lit up when I suggested it. Sounds perfect, she said, her voice a little too enthusiastic. In retrospect, it should have alerted me. That night she dressed to kill. A tight black dress that cinched her in all the right places, paired with red-heeled shoes that always made my heart race. She looked so stunning that I half-jokingly suggested we abandon our plans for the club and stay home. But Emma was adamant. Come on, she said, grinning. Let's do something out of the ordinary for once. We got to the club around 9 o'clock at night. The place was as classy as I'd heard, with soft leather chairs and a stage surrounded by glowing lights. The dancers weren't just strippers, they were entertainers. One of them climbed the pole with the kind of grace you'd expect from a professional athlete, and I was genuinely impressed. Emma snuggled up to me, laughing and clapping like she was at a concert. The drinks were flowing, and we were having a great time. At first, I didn't even notice how much Emma had drunk because she kept the conversation going, asking if I liked it, teasing me about blushing when one of the dancers looked at me. It was like a normal date night, only on a higher level. And then it happened. Emma got up from the table, adjusted her dress, and said, "I'll be right back." I figured she was headed for the restroom, so I barely glanced at her. But instead of heading towards the restrooms, she headed straight towards the stage. At first I thought she was just trying to be nice. Maybe she'd had too much to drink and wanted to make a joke. But when she got to the edge of the stage, she didn't stop. She took off her heeled shoes, handed them to one of the servers like she'd done it 100 times before, and walked up on stage. "Emma!" I half shouted, half laughed, thinking she was about to make a fool of herself. She ignored me. Then she turned to the DJ, made some sort of hand gesture, and suddenly the music changed. The thudding bass of some pop song faded away, replaced by a slower, sultry rhythm. What happened next was seared into my brain like a bad tattoo. Emma reached for the zipper on the back of her dress and pulled it down in one smooth motion. The crowd erupted in applause as she pulled the dress down and revealed her underwear, black lace, stockings. It was as if she'd planned the whole thing. I froze in place, watching her head toward the pole in the center of the stage. The way she moved wasn't the awkward, tipsy kind of dancing you'd expect from someone doing it of their own free will. No, it was something else. She moved with purpose, every step and every twirl around the pole matching the music perfectly. I could feel my heart pounding, with embarrassment, awkwardness, and something darker. Betrayal, maybe? As she climbed the pole and twirled around it with the kind of control and skill that only comes with years of practice, it hit me. It wasn't the first time, and far from the first time. After what seemed like an eternity had passed, the song ended and Emma came downstairs to raucous applause. She bowed, picked up her dress, and strode casually back to our table as if she hadn't just ripped the rug out from under my feet. I couldn't even get a word out. I just stared at her, hoping for some sort of explanation. "Relax," she said as she put her dress on like nothing had happened. "I just wanted to have a little fun." "Where the hell did you learn how to do that?" I finally managed to ask. She smiled, a token, almost mischievous smile I didn't recognize. "I have my secrets," she said, taking another sip of her drink. That was it. That was all her explanation. I spent the rest of the night in a daze, trying to piece together what I had just witnessed. Every time I thought about asking her a few more questions, I stopped myself. Was I ready to hear the answers? The car ride home passed in silence. Emma leaned against the window, humming to herself as if nothing had happened, and I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. By the time we got home, I was too exhausted both mentally and emotionally to push her any further. She climbed into bed, kissed me goodnight, and fell asleep almost instantly. I lay staring at the ceiling and my thoughts were racing. Who was this woman I had married? And what other secrets was she hiding? When Emma walked over to the pole and unbuttoned her dress, it was like watching a stranger. No. It was like watching a person I thought I knew transform into someone else right before my eyes. The crowd exploded as she took the stage, throwing her hair back like she'd done it 1,000 times before. She didn't hesitate, she didn't stumble, she didn't even flinch under the bright stage lights. She owned the moment, moving with a confidence impossible to fake. My stomach sank and my brain felt like it was short-circuiting, desperately trying to figure out what the hell was going on. It all felt surreal, as if I was trapped in some strange, alternate reality. Just a few minutes ago, we had been laughing, drinking, and watching the show together like any other couple blowing off steam. Now I sat with a clenched jaw, trying not to look too obvious, studying the faces of the other people in the room. Were they looking at her? Were they looking at me? Did anyone else realize that the woman on stage was supposed to be my wife? She wasn't just good, she was too good. Every spin, every lunge, every swing of her hips was precise, practiced, and thought out. I didn't want to admit it, but it was clear as day. This wasn't her first experience. My mind began to connect dots I hadn't even realized were there. The way she always seemed a little too comfortable when we talked about wild nights out. The way she never flinched when our friends joked about strip clubs or lewd parties. And how she smirked whenever I tried to joke about her confidence. I felt like I'd been handed the corner pieces of a puzzle I never wanted to put together, but suddenly everything fell into place. The song ended and Emma finished her performance by slowly spinning around the pole and sliding down, which sent the crowd into a frenzy. She didn't rush off the stage or look embarrassed. Instead, she stood still for a second, letting the applause die down, and then nonchalantly bent over, picked up her dress, and walked back to our table. I should have stood up, should have said something, should have done something, but I didn't. I just sat there, frozen as she lowered herself into her seat, as if she'd just returned from the restroom or something equally mundane. "Did you have fun?" she asked, smirking as she reached for her drink. I didn't know what to answer. My throat constricted, as if every word I wanted to say was stuck somewhere between anger and disbelief. Finally, I managed to mutter, "Where did you learn to do that?" Emma only shrugged, taking a long sip of her drink, then set it down and looked at me playfully. "What? You thought I couldn't dance?" It wasn't an answer, it was a deflection, and I knew it. The rest of the night passed like a blur. I remember us leaving the club, Emma's heels clicking on the sidewalk as we walked to the car. She didn't seem bothered at all, humming the radio to herself as I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When we got home, I thought about talking to her. I wanted answers, hell, I needed answers. But every time I opened my mouth, I stopped myself. What was I supposed to say? "Hey baby, are you secretly a stripper?" It sounded crazy, even in my head. Instead, I let it go. Or at least I tried to. But days went by, and that night gnawed at me. It wasn't just the dance, it was the way she acted afterward, like nothing had happened. Like she didn't just drop a bomb on me and walk away. After a few days, I decided to look into it myself. Emma had always been pretty secretive about her past, and I'd never really thought about it before. But now it seemed to me that there were parts of her life that she was intentionally hiding. I started small, scrolling through her old social media posts to see if I was missing anything. Most of her accounts were blocked, but I managed to find a few flagged photos from years ago. Shots of her with friends, nightclubbing, and one shot that made my stomach churn. It showed Emma standing in front of a stage, seemingly at a strip club. She wasn't dancing in the photo, but she was dressed appropriately. Short skirt, heels, a little too much makeup. The caption read, "Work hard, play harder woman dancing." After that, I couldn't stop anymore. I started digging deeper even though I knew it was detrimental. I found old reviews on Yelp about clubs in the area, one of which mentioned a dancer named Roxy, who looked an awful lot like Emma. But the most interesting thing happened when I discovered a private Instagram account linked to one of her friends. The profile picture was a group shot from a bachelorette party, and there, in the center, was Emma, or Roxy, I guess, posing on a pole like a freaking pro. I felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. This wasn't just disposable entertainment. This was her past, or maybe even her present, and she was hiding it from me. The next time I saw her, I couldn't hold back any longer. I didn't get into a fight right away, but decided to see if she would lie to my face. "So you've never worked at a club before?" I asked carelessly as we made dinner. Emma didn't even flinch. "No." "Why?" I wanted to believe her. I really wanted to. But the evidence was piling up, and the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much more was left of the woman I thought I knew. The worst part wasn't even the dancing. It was the secrecy. What else was she hiding from me? And why did I feel like I was the last person in her life to know the truth? I knew I'd have to make a choice soon. Confront her directly or keep digging and risk finding something even worse. But either way, one thing was becoming painfully clear. The Emma I married was not the Emma I thought I knew. For days after the night at the Velvet Orchid, my head felt like it was in a fog. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her on stage, twirling around the pole like she was born to do it. But it wasn't just the dancing that haunted me. It was the way she smirked when I asked her about it that haunted me. That cocky, almost defiant look told me she had no intention of telling me the truth. And then there was that guy, the one who recognized her. It was bad enough when she got up on stage, but when he stood up, shouted her name, not Emma, but some stage name I couldn't hear, and rushed toward her like a long-lost lover, it was like a punch to the gut. I don't know what I expected her to do, maybe recoil, maybe act confused, but she just laughed like it was no big deal. When he grabbed her hand and said, "It's so good to have you back," I blushed. I wasn't thinking. I just moved. I got to my feet and was in his face before I even realized what was happening. "Back off," I said, pushing him hard enough to make him stumble. The bouncer was there in seconds, pulling me away, and for a moment I thought I was the one who was going to be thrown out of the club. But then Emma intervened, calmed everyone down, and got me out the door before the situation got any worse. The car ride home was surreal. She was tipsy, humming along to the radio, acting like the whole night had been all fun and games. Meanwhile, I was gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white, going over everything that had happened in my mind. "Who was that guy?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. She shrugged, looking out the window. "Just some drunken idiot. Forget about him." Her casual rejection made a knot in my stomach. "And the dancing?" I asked. "Where did you learn that?" She smirked, the same damn smirk she'd gotten at the club. "I have my secrets," she said, her voice light and teasing. I wanted to press her, to demand answers, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the alcohol in her system, or maybe a gnawing fear that I wouldn't like what she had to say. Either way, I left it at that, for the time being. But I couldn't leave it alone. For the next few days, I replayed that night over and over in my head. Her movements on stage, the way that guy recognized her, the way she brushed it all off as nothing. It all didn't add up. Emma had always been outgoing, a little wild, but this was something else entirely. The worst part was that she acted as if nothing had happened. She went about her business like any other newlywed, texting me sweet nothings while she worked, cooking dinner together in the evenings, settling down on the couch to watch Netflix. If I didn't know better, I might have convinced myself that I was dreaming it all. But I knew better. I decided to do a little digging. I wasn't proud of it. I'd never been the snooping type, but I wanted answers. If Emma wasn't going to give them to me, I'd find them myself. One afternoon, when she'd left to run errands, I opened her laptop. She'd left it on the kitchen table, and I told myself I'd just check her search history. Nothing invasive. Just a quick look to see if there was anything there that might explain what was going on. Her browser history was clean, too clean. No search queries, no bookmarks, no social media logins. Either she'd never used her laptop for personal business, or she'd recently cleaned it out. Feeling guilty but desperate, I went to her email account. It was password protected, of course, but I remembered that she had once told me she used the same password for everything. I typed in the name of her childhood dog, and that's how I ended up inside. There was nothing unusual at first. The usual mix of work emails, receipts from online stores, and newsletters she never read. But then I saw it. A message from a man named Mick with the subject line, "Need to talk." I hesitated, my finger hovering over the trackpad. This was it. The Pandora's box I'd been so afraid of. But I couldn't stop. I clicked. The letter was short, just a couple of lines. But it came down on me like a ton of bricks. Asterisk Emma. We need to talk about last weekend. Call me when you get a chance. And for God's sake, be careful. Someone will notice if you keep this up. Mick. My hands were shaking as I read this. Keep it up? What the hell was that supposed to mean? And who the hell was Mick? I wanted to call her right now, demand an explanation, but I knew that was the wrong move. Not now. I needed more information. I began to watch her behavior more closely. Little things I hadn't paid attention to before suddenly seemed suspicious. The way she always kept her phone face down on the counter. The way she would disappear into the bedroom for work calls with the door closed. She always had the perfect explanation for where she was, but never any actual proof. One night while she was in the shower, I picked up her cell phone. It was locked, of course, but I saw her enter the passcode hundreds of times. My heart raced as I entered the numbers and swiped my finger up. Her messages were mostly innocent, messages from friends, family, coworkers. But then I found a message from Mick. I flipped through their messages, and with each word, my heart sank. They weren't overtly romantic or sexual, but they were intimate, familiar. He called her Roxy, and she didn't correct him. She'd joke about her skills on the pole, and he'd respond with a winking emoji. The last text was from him, sent the morning after our night at the Velvet Orchid. Last night was risky, Roxy. Let's not make that mistake again. By the time Emma got out of the shower, I'd put her phone back on the counter and was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the wall. She walked in, wrapped in a towel, and threw me a puzzled look. Are you okay? She asked, taking a glass of water. I forced myself to smile and nodded. Yeah, I said, my voice hollow. Just tired. She bought it. She always bought it. But I wasn't okay. Not even close. And I knew this was just the beginning of the nightmare I'd gotten myself into. When Emma's phone rang that evening, I didn't want to look. I really didn't want to. But it was right there on the table, glowing with the kind of bright, eye-catching light that's impossible to miss in a dimly lit kitchen. And then there was the name, Mick. Mick was not a name I had ever heard her say before. Not in passing, not as a friend from college, not as a coworker. But it wasn't just the name. It was the message that made my stomach rumble. You were great last night. Let's talk about next weekend. I froze in place, the words sounding like a siren in my head. Awesome last night? What the hell does that mean? And next weekend? Is this some kind of recurring thing? The shower was still running upstairs, so I had a decision to make. Should I open my phone and dig deeper, or leave it at that? Every instinct was screaming at me to open it, but something was holding me back. Maybe guilt, or fear, or some false hope that all was not as it seemed. I stepped away from the counter and pretended I hadn't noticed anything. But thoughts were already swirling around in my head. When Emma came downstairs, her hair still damp and smelling faintly of coconut shampoo, I sat at the kitchen table, pretending to flip through my phone. My heart was pounding frantically, but I forced myself to remain calm. Hi, I said without looking up. She walked over, picked up her phone, and unlocked it with her thumb. I couldn't help but notice how her eyes lingered on the screen for just a second before she put the phone down again. Who's Mick? I asked, keeping my tone light as if I was just keeping the conversation going. Emma didn't miss a beat. Oh, he's an old friend of mine, she said, reaching for a glass in the cupboard. Why? An old friend? Of course he is. I wanted to press her, to ask why this old friend was texting her about how amazing she was last night, but I held back. Too much pressure might lead her to think I'd seen the message, and I wasn't ready for that kind of confrontation yet. Just curious, I said, forcing myself to smile. She didn't ask any questions and didn't seem the least bit upset. That was what bothered me the most. She was too calm, too collected, as if she'd already rehearsed her answer in case I ever broached the subject of Mick. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about that message. It was like a thorn in my brain that I couldn't ignore no matter how hard I tried. I replayed our conversation, analyzing every word, every facial expression. Was she lying? Maybe I was overreacting? But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The Emma I thought I knew would have told me about Mick if he was really just an old friend. She wouldn't have brushed off a question like that so easily. I began to watch her behavior more closely, searching for anything that might explain this text. And the more I watched, the more I noticed inconsistencies. For example, she was more careful with her phone. She used to leave it unattended, but now she always kept it close by. When we sat on the couch watching TV, she would glance at it every few minutes, turning the screen away from me. Then there were the late nights. Emma had always been a social butterfly, so it wasn't unusual for her to go out with her friends from time to time. But lately her outings had become more frequent, and her explanations seemed vague. "It's just a girls' night out," she'd say, putting on her heeled shoes and grabbing her purse. Or, "Work has been stressful. I just need a drink to relax." But she never said who she was meeting or where she was going. And when I asked, she'd just smile and say, "You don't need to worry about me." One night I decided to test my suspicions. Emma told me she was meeting some coworkers for happy hour. So I waited about an hour after she left and then called one of her closest work friends, Sarah. "Hi, Sarah," I said, trying to sound casual. "Just wondering, are you out with Emma today?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "No," Sarah said. "I haven't seen Emma outside of work in weeks." My stomach churned. "Is everything okay?" asked Sarah, a note of concern in her voice. "Yeah, everything's fine," I lied. "Thanks, Sarah. Just curious." I hung up and sat staring at the phone, trying to comprehend what I had just learned. Emma had lied to me. A blatant lie. When she got home later that night, I watched her closely. She seemed, normal, relaxed. She kissed me on the cheek, poured herself a glass of wine, and asked me how my day was, as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't let it go unheeded. "Where did you go tonight?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. She didn't miss a beat. "To the usual place with the girls," she replied, smiling, sipping her wine. I nodded, pretending to accept her answer. But inside I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into the abyss. The next morning, while Emma was in the shower, I finally gave in to temptation. I opened her phone. Her correspondence with Mick was still there, and as I flipped through it, my worst fears were confirmed. There were messages about a meeting, about how everything had to be discreet. Mick called her Roxy, and she wouldn't correct him. They joked about her performance at the club, and he mentioned that she still has it. But the message that struck me the most was the one that read, "I miss the old days. Have you ever thought about going back full-time?" She replied, "Not sure yet. Let me deal with a few things first." I closed the phone and sat back down, my hands shaking. This wasn't just a one-off. This was her life, her other life, and I wasn't a part of it. I didn't argue with her right away. I didn't know how to do that. Instead, I spent the rest of the day in a daze, trying to figure out what to do. How do you confront someone you thought you knew, someone you thought you could trust, and tell them they lied to you? How do you prepare for the consequences, for the fact that everything you'd built together might have turned out to be a lie? I didn't have any answers. But one thing was clear. Emma wasn't the woman I thought she was. And I wasn't sure if I could ever look at her the same way again. Curiosity is a funny thing. It's an itch you can't scratch, a pebble in your shoe you can't ignore. That's exactly how I felt after finding Mick's name in Emma's messages. It wasn't enough to know he existed. It was enough to know who he was and why he was so connected to my wife's secrets. It didn't take long to track him down. Mick owned a small photography studio in downtown Denver, near the Velvet Orchid. His business had decent reviews online and apparently specialized in portraits, headshots, and events. It was innocent enough on the surface, but my gut told me there was more to the story behind it. One afternoon, while Emma was at work, I decided to pay Mick a visit. My excuse? I needed professional shots for work. It wasn't a serious lie, but it was all I could come up with on such short notice. When I walked into the studio, Mick greeted me with such overly friendly energy that my nerves immediately gave way. He was a tall guy in his 40s, with a wiry figure and a face that looked like it had seen a lot of late nights. His smile was wide but didn't reach his eyes, and his handshake lingered for a second. "What can I do for you?" he asked, leading me over to a couch that looked like it belonged in a college dorm. I told him about the headshots I needed, trying to sound as casual as possible. He nodded and pulled out a portfolio to show me his work. I looked at the pictures, but my thoughts were occupied with something else. I was trying to figure out how to steer the conversation towards Emma without raising alarms. Finally, I decided to just rip the Band-Aid off. "Hey, do you know someone named Emma?" I asked, keeping my tone light. His demeanor changed immediately. His smile faded, and for a split second I saw surprise, or maybe even fear, flash in his eyes. But he quickly regained his composure and leaned back in his chair, shrugging nonchalantly. "Emma?" he said, as if trying out the name by ear. "Yeah, I know her. We've worked together a few times." "Worked together. Right." I fought the urge to press him, trying to play it cool. "Small world," I said with a chuckle. "She's my wife." Mick's reaction to that was harder to understand. His expression barely changed, but there was a noticeable pause before he responded. "She has her own ways of dealing with things," he said cryptically, his voice lower, almost cautious. It was a phrase I remembered long after I left the studio. She has her own way of solving problems. What the hell was that supposed to mean? Was it a warning? A veiled confession? I didn't get any concrete answers from Mick that day, but his reaction told me one thing. He knew more than he was saying. And whatever he knew, it wasn't something he wanted to share with me. I spent the rest of the day hanging around the house and replaying the entire conversation in my head. Mick had been friendly enough at first, but as soon as Emma's name was mentioned, he became cautious, wary. He seemed to be weighing his words, trying to decide how much to say without implicating himself or her. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. It wasn't just about the dance anymore. It wasn't just about a text from some random guy. It was about the fact that my wife was living a double life, and I was the last person to know about it. That night I tried to act normal. Emma came home from work, kissed me on the cheek, and started cooking dinner like everything was normal. But I couldn't shake the tension building in my chest. When we sat down to eat, I watched her closely, studying every little detail. The way she avoided eye contact, the way she changed the subject when I asked her how her day was going. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Do you know someone named Mick?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. Emma froze for half a second, long enough for me to notice it, but then forced herself to smile. "Mick? Yeah, I think so, yeah. Why?" "I met him today," I said, leaning back in my chair. "I went over to his studio to take some pictures. He mentioned that you two work together." Her smile faded, and I saw her hands tighten around her fork. "Oh, that Mick," she said, laughing nervously. "Yeah, he's a photographer. We did a few shoots together back in the day. Nothing special." Back in the day. Another vague answer. Another evasion. "What kind of shoots?" I asked, keeping my tone casual but firm. Emma's eyes darted toward the kitchen, as if she were looking for an escape route. "Just a portfolio," she replied quickly. "You know, modeling gigs. That was years ago." Years ago. Portfolios. Modeling gigs. Every word was rehearsed, as if she'd been preparing for weeks for this explanation. After dinner, Emma retired to the bedroom, claiming she had a headache. I sat in the living room, staring at the wall, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Mick's cryptic comment, Emma's nervous excuses, the messages about next weekend and maintaining confidentiality. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but I didn't like the picture emerging from them. I decided to return to Mick's studio the next day, this time without any pretense that I needed pictures. I wanted answers, and I wasn't leaving until I got them. When I walked in, Mick was surprised to see me. He was busy getting ready for the shoot, but he put the camera aside and smiled warily at me. "Back so soon?" he asked, trying to sound casual. I didn't engage in small talk. "Look, I need to know the truth," I said, my voice flat. "What's going on with Emma?" Mick's smile faded, and for a moment he just stood there studying me, as if trying to decide if I should be bothered. Finally he sighed and gestured for me to sit down. "She has her secrets," he said, choosing his words carefully as if they were landmines. "But it's not my place to tell them." That was all he said. No matter how much I insisted, no matter how many questions I asked, Mick refused to tell. He wasn't just protecting himself. He was protecting Emma. I left the studio feeling more frustrated than ever. Mick didn't give me the answers I wanted, but he confirmed one thing without a shadow of a doubt. Emma's double life wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real, and it was more than I'd ever expected. Now I just had to figure out what to do about it. That night when I confronted Emma about Mick, I half expected her to confess. It seemed to me that if I gave her a chance, she'd admit the truth or at least part of it, so I'd be reassured. But instead, she stuck to her opinion, doubling down on the fact that whatever had bound them together was ancient history. "We worked together years ago," she said, her voice sharp and defensive. "It was just a job. Why are you making a big deal out of it?" The way she said it, so dismissive, as if I was the one who'd overreacted, made my blood boil. But I bit my tongue. If she didn't want to be honest, I'd get to the truth myself. A few days later, Emma told me she was going out for drinks with friends. She said it casually, as she always did, but something in her tone made me wary. It was all too rehearsed, too comfortable, so I decided to follow her. I waited until she left the house, then grabbed my car keys and headed outside a few minutes after her. My heart was pounding the whole time, a mixture of adrenaline and fear flowing through my veins. I felt like a teenager sneaking out after curfew, only this wasn't some harmless game. My marriage was at stake. Emma didn't go to the bar she was talking about. She didn't even head that way. Instead, she drove across town, straight to the Velvet Orchid. The sight of her pulling into the parking lot struck me to the core. For a while, I just sat in the car, staring at the glowing neon sign and trying to convince myself that there must be an innocent explanation for this. Maybe she was meeting her friends here. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But deep down, I knew it was for the best. I parked a few spaces away from her and followed her inside, staying in the shadows as long as possible. The club was noisy and dimly lit, the smell of cheap cologne and spilled drinks lingering in the air. I kept my head down, hoping no one would notice me, and scanned the room for Emma. It didn't take long to find her. She wasn't sitting at the bar or with her friends, she was backstage, dressed in the same outfit she'd worn the night she climbed the pole. My chest clenched as I watched her. She wasn't just here to hang out. She was here to perform. When she took the stage, the crowd erupted into applause. Emma, or should I say Roxy, moved with the same effortless grace as the first time I saw her dance. It was like watching a completely different person who didn't have to worry about bills, work, or a husband waiting at home. I couldn't look away, though every second was like a knife stabbing into my gut. This wasn't a one-off. This wasn't her outlet or her memories. This was a part of her life, an important part that she was hiding from me. After the show, Emma disappeared behind a thick velvet curtain labeled VIP. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should follow her, but before I could make up my mind, Mick slipped behind the curtain after her. It was a pivotal moment. Watching her dance was one thing, but watching her walk into the VIP area with Mick, that was another. I moved closer, trying to get a better look at her without drawing attention to myself. The bouncer guarding the curtain gave me a sharp look, and I backed away, pretending to leaf through my phone while keeping my eyes on the entrance. Minutes passed, each one stretching like an eternity. Thoughts raced through my head, each one worse than the last. What were they doing in there? Talking? Laughing? Something else? When Emma finally came out, she looked calm, almost casual, as if she hadn't spent God knows how much time behind closed doors with Mick. She left the club without looking back, and I waited a few minutes before following her, my heart pounding the whole time. When I got home, Emma was already in bed, pretending to be asleep. I stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her and wondering how we'd gotten to this life. How had the woman I had married, the woman I thought I knew best, become a stranger? That night, I didn't confront her. I didn't know how to do that. Instead, I sat on the couch, staring at the ceiling and going over in my head everything I'd seen. The dancing, the VIP room, Mick. It was all too much, and yet it felt like it was just the tip of the iceberg. The next morning, Emma was acting like nothing had happened. She kissed me on the cheek, made coffee, and chatted about her plans for the day like it was any other Saturday. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I just nodded, feigning interest while questions swarmed in my head. How long had this been going on? What else was she hiding? And most importantly, who was my wife? The Emma I thought I knew was gone, and in her place was someone I didn't recognize. Someone with secrets, lies, and a completely different life that I had no part in. And for the first time in our marriage, I wasn't sure if we could ever find our way back to each other, or if I even wanted to. I don't know if I can describe what it feels like when the person you thought you knew best tells you that they lied to you. Not just once, not just for a while, but in a way that makes you question your entire relationship. It wasn't just about Emma still stripping. It was about the way she said it, without the slightest remorse, like it was the most natural thing in the world. It's not just about the money, she said, her voice calm but firm. It's about who I am. Those words knocked the spirit out of me. I didn't even know how to respond. My thoughts were swirling around in my head, trying to find something to say, something to make it all make sense, but nothing came. When Emma walked into the house that night, I was already waiting for her. As soon as the door closed behind her, I told her what I'd seen. About the dance, about the VIP room, about Mika. I laid it all out for her, hoping, praying that she'd have some explanation that would make it all make sense. But she didn't. She didn't deny it. She didn't try to lie or brush it off. She just stood there looking at me with a strange mixture of defiance and submission, as if she'd been waiting for this moment and already knew how it would end. "I've never really quit," she admitted, shrugging her shoulders as if it was no big deal. Those 4 words were like a punch to the gut. For weeks, I'd been putting together the puzzle of Emma's double life, hoping I was wrong, hoping it was some kind of misunderstanding. But hearing her say it out loud shattered any illusions I had left. "You never left?" I repeated, my voice shaking. "You've been lying to me all this time?" She didn't flinch. "I didn't think you'd understand," she said, crossing her arms over her chest. "It's not just the money. It's part of who I am, and it always has been. Part of who she is." I couldn't get my head around it. This wasn't the woman I thought I'd married. The woman who laughed at my stupid jokes, who baked pancakes on Sunday mornings, who cried while watching Pixar movies. This was a completely different woman I didn't recognize. "How long?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "How long have you been doing this?" She hesitated, just for a moment, and I could see she was weighing her words. "I stopped for a while," she said finally. "When we first started dating, I wanted to see if I could put it behind me, but it wasn't right. It wasn't like me. Not like her." Those words hurt more than I'd expected. "So all this time you've been sneaking around behind my back?" I said, my anger finally breaking through. "Lied to me every day?" Emma shook her head. "I wasn't sneaking around. I just didn't tell you. There's a difference." "A difference?" snapped I, getting up from the couch. "You've been living a completely different life, Emma. You've been lying to me about who you are, what you do, everything. How the hell can you call that sneaking around?" For the first time that evening, she looked genuinely upset. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said quietly, "but I couldn't give it up, not completely. I tried, but it's who I am. I thought maybe if I kept it separate, it wouldn't matter." Wouldn't matter. Those words echoed in my head like a cruel joke. "You thought it wouldn't matter?" I repeated, my voice trailing off. "Emma, you're my wife. How the hell could you think something like this wouldn't matter?" She didn't have an answer to that question. Or maybe she did, but she didn't want to say it out loud. Either way, the silence that followed was deafening. I slept on the couch that night, not because Emma asked me to, but because I couldn't be in the same room with her. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her on stage, saw her walking into the VIP room with Mick, saw her looking at me with a defiant, peremptory expression on her face. Part of me wanted to believe that we could work through this, that there was some way to salvage what was left of our marriage. But another part of me, a big part, felt like the foundation of our relationship had been ripped out from under me. How do you rebuild something when the person you should have trusted the most lied to you from the beginning? How do you move on when every word he says seems like another carefully constructed half-truth? The next morning, Emma acted as if nothing had happened. She made coffee, checked her phone, and started getting ready for work, still with the same calm and collected look she had the night before. I watched her from the couch, wondering how she could be so unaffected. Was this really just another performance for her? Another mask she put on to keep up appearances? When she left for work, I felt a strange mixture of relief and emptiness. Relief that I wouldn't have to see her, at least not for a while. Emptiness that the woman I loved, the woman I thought I knew, was gone. I spent the rest of the day going over everything in my head, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the more I thought about it, the more questions I had. How long had she been lying to me? How many more secrets was she keeping? And most importantly, why didn't she trust me enough to tell me the truth? I wanted to face her again, to demand answers, but I didn't know if I could hear them. Part of me was afraid that the more I dug in, the worse it would get. But the other part of me, the stubborn, angry part, knew I couldn't leave it at that. Not without a fight. If Emma thought she could keep hiding behind her lies, she was wrong. I wasn't going to sit back and let her make a fool of me. Not anymore. Whatever the truth is, I'm gonna find it. And I'm gonna make sure she can't hide from it anymore. You think you know a man. You think you've seen all sides of him, his ups and downs, his quirks and secrets. But what do you do when you realize that the person lying next to you in bed isn't who you thought they were? When every piece of the puzzle you put together reveals a picture you don't recognize? That's exactly the position I was in with Emma. Each new discovery about her life was like peeling another layer off the stranger I married. It had all started innocently enough, or as innocent as peeping can be. After our confrontation, I couldn't get over it. I told myself I just needed clarity, a reason for her lies, an explanation that would make it all make sense. But the truth was, I didn't trust her anymore. I couldn't. I dug deeper, piecing together fragments of her phone, emails, and conversations that she tried to dismiss as meaningless. And then I came across something that stopped me dead in my tracks. A folder on her laptop labeled Velvet Accounts. At first glance, they were the usual business records, spreadsheets, invoices, payroll logs. But the deeper I looked into the folder, the more I realized what I was looking at. These weren't just records of some side business. These were detailed reports on all of Velvet Orchid's activities, down to the client lists and payments for VIP services. Emma wasn't just a dancer. She wasn't just a person who couldn't leave her past behind. She was a co-owner of the club. The realization of that hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just a hobby or something she did on the side. This was her business, her livelihood. Something she'd been running behind my back for God knows how long. But that wasn't the worst of it. The client lists in those records weren't just names. These were Denver's elite, corporate executives, politicians, even a few familiar faces from the local news. And the services they were paying for? Let's just say they went far beyond lap dances. Emma wasn't just dancing. She ran an operation that catered to men willing to pay for extra favors. It made me uncomfortable. This wasn't the woman I married. This wasn't the life I'd signed up for. And then there was Mick. His name came up again and again in these records, but not as a client, but as a partner. Payments to him, from him, records of meetings and expansion plans. The more I read, the clearer it became. Mick wasn't just Emma's photographer. He was her business partner. Questions swirled in my head that I didn't want to answer. How deep was their partnership? Was it just business, or was it more than that? Every time I thought about them together, late nights at the club, private meetings behind closed doors, I could feel the rage building inside me. I had to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt me. The next day, I met up with Mick again. This time I didn't hold back. I know Emma is co-owner of the club, I said, barely waiting for him to acknowledge me. I know about the VIP services, the clients, everything. So don't waste my time pretending you don't know what I'm talking about. For a moment, Mick just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as if he were dealing with a particularly difficult client. Look, he said at last, I don't know what Emma told you, but yes, we're business partners. Have been for years. Business partners, I repeated, sarcasm in my voice. And that's all you do? Mick hesitated, and in that moment I realized everything. I didn't need him to say it. The look on his face told me everything I wanted to know. We've had our moments, he admitted, his tone careful, measured. But it's complicated. Complicated. That word lit me up like a match of gasoline. Complicated? Snapped back at me. You've been screwing around with my wife and running an illegal operation together, and you think complicated is everything? Mick didn't answer anything, which only fueled my anger. I stood up, fists clenched, ready to throw that smug expression off his face. But before I could do that, he said something that made me freeze in place. "You think I'm the bad guy here?" he said, his voice low, almost amused. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." I left the studio more confused and angry than ever. What the hell did Mick mean? What didn't I know? When I got home, Emma was waiting for me. She must have known I was digging because she didn't even try to act normal. Instead, she went straight into damage control mode. "I didn't want you to find out like this," she said, her voice flat, but with something akin to regret audible in it. "Find out what?" replied I. "That you lied to me from the beginning? That you and Mick had some shady dealings? That you've been hiding behind my back for years?" Emma flinched, but didn't argue. "I never meant to hurt you," she said quietly. "But this is my life. It's who I am. I didn't think you'd understand." It was the second time she'd said, "It's who I am." But what did that mean? Who was she? The woman I thought I'd married? Or the stranger standing in front of me now? "I don't even know who you are now," I said, and my voice trailed off. Emma looked up at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't define, maybe guilt or sadness. "I'm still me," she said softly. "You just never knew that part of me." And with those words, she walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts, my anger, and the crushing realization that the woman I loved was someone I could never truly understand. For the first time since this nightmare began, I began to wonder if our marriage could survive this, or if it's even worth it. As I sit here staring at the screen, the weight of everything that has happened feels suffocating. Writing these lines is supposed to help me clear things up, give me some clarity, but instead it's like I'm standing on the edge of a cliff, trying to decide if I should jump. Emma's asleep upstairs, or at least I think she is. I can no longer tell if the peacefulness I see when I look at her is real, or if it's just another mask she's put on. Either way, I didn't bother to join her in bed tonight. I couldn't. Every time I close my eyes, all I see is the life she's built without me. The lies, the secrets, the betrayal. I spent weeks trying to piece it all together, hoping that somehow it would make sense. I've rewatched every conversation we had, every excuse she made, every moment when I should have noticed the signs. And I can't shake the feeling that I've been a fool all this time. How did I not see it? How did I not notice the late nights, the guarded phone, the perfectly rehearsed responses? Was I that blind? Or was she just hiding it so well? And then there's the even more important question. Why? Why did she lie to me? Why didn't she trust me enough to tell me the truth? Was it because she thought I wouldn't accept her? Or because she didn't care enough to try? The thing is, I still love her. Even after everything that's happened, I can't just turn her off. Love isn't a switch you can flip. It's a tangle of emotions that won't let you go no matter how much you want it to. But love isn't enough. Not enough anymore. Trust is the foundation of any relationship, and Emma ruined ours the moment she decided to hide her double life from me. It wasn't just about the stripping, the business, or even Mika. It was about the fact that she chose to keep me in the dark, to make decisions that involved both of us without thinking about how I might feel. I thought about leaving. I thought about packing my things, walking out the door and never looking back. Part of me knows it would be easier that way, cleaner, easier. But another part of me keeps asking, what if? What if there is still something worth preserving? What if we can rebuild that lost trust? What if the person I fell in love with is still inside, buried under lies and secrets? That's the problem with love. It makes you hope, even when you know better. I've tried talking to her. I've tried asking her to explain why she did what she did, to help me understand how we ended up here. But every conversation ends the same way. She says, "I didn't mean to hurt you," or "It's just the way I am." Those words aren't enough. They're just excuses that don't address the underlying issues. I need more than that. I need honesty, vulnerability, real effort to fix what's broken. But I'm not sure Emma is capable of that. A few days ago, I found myself standing in front of the courthouse, staring at the door and contemplating whether I should go inside. Filing for divorce would have been easy, a clean break. A way to start fresh without the baggage of Emma's lies weighing me down. But I couldn't do that. Not yet. Maybe I'm a coward. Maybe I'm holding on to something that's already gone. Or maybe I'm just not ready to let go of the life I thought we were building together. The truth is, I don't know what to do. Leaving means giving up the woman I've loved for years, the woman I thought I would spend the rest of my life with. But to stay means living with the knowledge that she lied to me, that she chose her secrets over our marriage, that I may never be able to fully trust her again. It's a lose-lose situation, and whichever path I choose, I know I'll be in pain. For now, I'm stuck in uncertainty. I do all the activities, work, eat, sleep, repeat, but everything feels empty. I can't talk to anyone about it. How do you explain to friends or family that your wife is living a double life, that she's been lying to you for years? And even if I could tell them, what would they say? Would they advise me to leave, to move on, to find someone who deserves me? Or would they advise me to stay, to fight for the woman I love, to try to save what's left of our marriage? I don't know. And frankly, I'm not sure it matters. At the end of the day, it's my decision. And so here I am, sitting in the dark, typing my story and hoping that telling it will help me figure out what to do next. Maybe it will. Or maybe it will just be another way to pass the time while I try to make sense of a life that has fallen apart. All I know is that something has to change. I can't keep living like this, torn between the person Emma pretends to be and the person she really is. At some point, I have to make a choice. Do I walk away and start over, knowing that I'll never be able to understand why she lied? Or do I stay and try to rebuild everything, knowing that the trust we had may never come back? Right now, as I write these lines, I'm still trying to decide what kind of person I want to be.